I like to think that one of the things I've brought to the topic of retro motorcycles here on YouTube is just a more thorough look at the motivations for manufacturers behind the design and production of these machines, and really the deeper reasons that they're so appealing to many riders. One of the more enjoyable ways for me to do this has been to look at the history and development of these motorcycles to get a better understanding of the bikes that these motorcycles are pointing back to. It might seem odd to talk about the history of a relatively new kind of motorcycle, again, a motorcycle that's meant to point back to the motorcycles of old. But at this point, there are now retro motorcycles that are in and of themselves classic bikes. So yes, they were meant originally to point back, but now decades on, we're looking back at those bikes themselves as just interesting motorcycles in history. Retro motorcycles do have a really rich history. I've covered the complete history of modern classic motorcycles in my video creatively titled The Strange History of Modern Classic Motorcycles. In that video, I try to not only cover the more popular models, bikes like the Triumph Bonneville and Kawasaki W series, but also the less known bikes that have influenced this huge segment of the market. Today we're looking at the strangest and perhaps single least known and least successful retro motorcycle ever made, and the odd reasons why it came into production. We're talking about the Suzuki SW1. So a while back, I was chatting with my dad about how I wanted to do merch for the channel, like t-shirts, that kind of stuff. And the reason I was talking with him specifically about this is pretty simple. He basically is this channel's demographic. And he filled me in on a little secret. Old dudes like hats, not only because hats are cool, but hats keep your bald or balding head from getting sunburnt. This was a revelation to me. So here it is, guys. As we've just hit the 100K sub mark, I present the official Bart Dad Cap. I've got a link in the description below. If you guys like hats or you just want to support the channel, check it out. Or if you're not a hat guy or girl and you still want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee on my Buy Me a Coffee page, which I've also linked below. I'm trying to save up for a project motorcycle that I'll show you guys soon if we can afford it. But anyways, thanks for all the support and love on the channel over the past few years, and let's keep this thing rolling. Like all good retro motorcycles, at first glance, it can be difficult to pin down when exactly this bike came out. A keen eye will note the master cylinder and large disc brake, and probably guess that a bike like this is from the 90s or later. And that would be correct. This bike came out the same year that I was born, in 1992. But unlike me, it was alive for only 1 year. Though we often associate the retro bike and neo cafe racer movement more with the 2000s and the introduction of the Bonneville and the Kawasaki W650, the SW1 is one of many attempts at a bike made in a very similar spirit, but quite a bit earlier. The Yamaha SR400 and 500 are arguably the first ever retro motorcycles made to look like bikes from about a decade or so before their release. And then the Honda GB models came out in the mid-80s with thoroughly British styling, powered by big thumpy singles. Now, what's interesting about these early retro bikes is the motorcycles that they're pointing to. See, today, retro bikes pretty much always try to point back to the British bikes of the 60s. But things were different at this time. And that's partially because everybody today, when they customize a bike, for the most part, is kind of going for that look as well. And so that's what the manufacturers are trying to do also. Though very much styled like a big British twin roadster from the 60s, the Yamaha SR line were powered by big singles like earlier 50s British bikes. The GB models went even further down this road, emulating the styling of bikes like the Norton Manx and especially the Velocette Thruxton. For whatever reason at this point, the Japanese manufacturers were starting to want to emulate the British motorcycles of old, the very motorcycles that they had just obliterated in the 70s. And Suzuki decided that they wanted in on the action. As the 90s got underway, Suzuki found themselves really at the pinnacle of motorcycle development, in competition with the other Japanese brands, and really in the thick of the horsepower races, and very much a part of the move towards more tech-heavy motorcycles and more performance-oriented motorcycles, both on and off-road. So why the hell would they make a motorcycle like this? The truth is, we don't actually know. In fact, we know very, very little about this motorcycle and its development. We know that the design was actually done outside of Suzuki by a guy named Naoki Sakai, but beyond that, much of this motorcycle's development is pretty much a mystery. So let's speculate for a bit. When I look at the SW1, I see two possible motivations. First, Suzuki was looking to make a unique retro motorcycle in at least a similar vein to the Honda GB models. Now, I know this bike does look very different from those ones, but I'll explain how this all makes sense in a bit. The second option is that Suzuki was trying to make a sort of alternative motorcycle to bikes like the Honda Pacific Coast, and this bike, with all of its ridiculous storage and scooter-like features, would make it very utilitarian. So I think those are the two options, and what I believe is that both are true to some extent. So let's talk about the motorcycle's styling. Unlike so many motorcycles from history, we don't have first-hand sources from Suzuki telling us really what they were going for with this bike. So we sort of have to infer it. We do know that apparently the S in SW stands for Suzuki and W stands for water. I'm not sure exactly what that means in terms of the bike, but we do know that it's probably because the designer in his studio, the name of his studio was Water and Suzuki and Water. But when you do look at the SW1 through the lens of history and you see at this time that there was this push for some of the Japanese companies to emulate old British motorcycles, it does kind of start to become clearer. Remember how I said that there have been different eras of British bikes that companies emulate with their retro bikes? Well, the SW1 appears to be pointing to a few of the very worst in terms of styling. The first is the short-lived bathtub era of British roadsters. Before the Bonneville really came into its own in the 60s, and at that time, doing away with the fatter curved seat in favor of the sleeker flat bench seat, and also moving from a nacelle headlight to the simpler bolted-on headlight, before all of that, Triumph and even the company Vincent were experimenting with high-performance motorcycles that featured a large, almost Harley-esque front fender with also a large piece of rear bodywork that came to be known as a bathtub. This 50s experiment was meant to add a level of cleanliness for the rider, but here in America, this was absolutely hated from the get-go, and so dealerships would often just take these off to give the bike a more stripped-back look. And so it's kind of in this tradition that the SW1 looks the way it does, but it also seems to be pointing, perhaps even more, to another old British bike from the 50s, that is the Vincent Black Prince and Black Knight. These were really, in many people's eyes, misguided attempts at updating the styling for the Black Shadow. And though more bodywork and more enclosed kinds of motorcycles would be the future well down the road from the 50s, at this time these were just bad and so ugly. You could even argue that the SW1 was also pointing to the later British attempts at making scooters, bikes like the Ariel Leader and the Ariel Arrow. It's all of these failed British motorcycle models that the failed SW1 seems to be emulating. Now, you could also argue that there is some Vespa influence there, but yeah, this idea of making a bike look like an old failed motorcycle, all of this would be like making a modern motorcycle today that emulates the style of a BRR 1200 or BMW K1. Like, why would you do that? And that's the question. Why? My best guess is that they saw some sort of potential in a sort of retro-styled motorcycle/scooter that would have much of the utility of those old machines. Lots of storage, an enclosed bodywork. There are benefits to these things for many riders. In a sense, this was like a Honda Pacific Coast with car-level storage, but the whole design was so opposite that of the supposedly futuristic Honda Pacific Coast or even K1. So it's like a retro version of those bikes. Aside from the large panniers, what appears to be a gas tank is actually a large frunk for even more storage. Underneath the seat, there's a large storage compartment as well. For its class, the SW1 was probably one of the most utilitarian motorcycles that you could buy, at least in this regard. It was more powerful than a scooter, and it had the storage of a much larger touring bike. But as a touring machine, the SW was nothing compared to those bikes. It was powered by the simple 250cc 4-stroke single from the GN250, which meant it made like 20 horsepower, which isn't much when apparently the bike weighed 646 pounds. I've seen that on multiple sites. There's no way that's right. From watching videos of people riding these, I'm sorry, they do not look that heavy. That would be like a Sportster 1200, but with a third of the power. There's no way. Sadly, this motorcycle was never available outside of Japan. I mean, here in America, we would have bought like 2 of them probably. It seems as though Suzuki was probably testing the waters a bit, no pun intended, by having it just start as a domestic product and see if people were interested and see if people liked the bike, and then they would potentially expand beyond Japan and up the production, but only 200 models were ever produced in its 1 year of production, making it one of the rarest motorcycles from this era. The SW1 marks a time in Suzuki's history when they were just much more willing to experiment with weird, unique designs. Though we may remember the 90s as a time when manufacturers took massive leaps forward, especially in terms of performance, there are lots of odd motorcycles that came out at this time. Sure, we get concept bikes today that maybe are crazy and do showcase what the brands are capable of, but we all know most of the time there's no actual interest in bringing those to production. It's all just the same boring stuff year after year. As easy as it is to make fun of weird, failed motorcycles from the past, I actually find bikes like this rather endearing. It's very clear that quite a lot of thought went into this bike. The strange cream color is just so unique and, in my opinion, really appealing. The design as a whole feels put together and consistent. And again, there's clear benefits to all of this. It's all very purposeful. I just wish more companies today would be willing to experiment a bit more and try making odd little bikes with more specific, interesting styling, and be willing to produce motorcycles in smaller numbers and for smaller markets like this bike was. We would have more variety instead of every manufacturer rushing to make the same middleweight adventure bike or the same high-tech sport bike. Today, if a model isn't going to sell to the masses, then it's just not worth it. And especially for the big Japanese manufacturers. Just imagine Suzuki doing something like this today, making something like the SW1 today. It's never going to happen. If you peruse YouTube, you'll find loads of videos of people just enjoying their SW1, riding them often, using them. They may be odd, but they're great little bikes. Again, if they don't weigh over 600 pounds, they're great. If they do, then everything I'm saying is not true because that is insane. You get my point though. There's loads of different people with odd interests. A new bike can come out and 90% of people hate it, but then there'll be that other 10% that for some reason the bike speaks to them and they're ready to spend their hard-earned cash on it. The SW1 may be the least successful Suzuki of all time. It may be the strangest, and in terms of sales, worst retro bike of all time, but for me it's a testament to an era that is just now long gone. Aside from companies like Janus, there really aren't ways to get new, strange, fun little retro bikes, and I think that's kind of sad. Shout out to Janus though. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you've had any experience with this bike, let us know down in the comments below, and until next time, ride safe.